This week, Dr. Eric Mueller from the University of Georgia explains colic.
It's a generalized term that means pain originating from the abdomen.
And why this symptom needs to be taken so seriously.
It's the #1 killer of adult horses.
So get comfortable, kick your boots off, and join me. This is The Horse Show, and I'm Rick Lamb. At the University of Georgia, Dr. Eric Mueller is a busy man. He's a full professor, director of equine programs, chief of staff at the Large Animal Veterinary Medical Teaching Hospital, and a surgeon. I caught up with him in Hawaii to talk about colic and why it can be so deadly for horses. How do you define colic to your veterinary students?
It's a generalized term that means pain originating from the abdomen. So most of the time it's associated with the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach, the small intestine, or the large intestine, but it can also come from other organs that are in the abdomen, such as the uterus, the lungs that are cranial to the abdomen or in front of the abdomen. They can act like colic. So it's just a general term for pain originating from the abdominal cavity.
Now, when I think of colic, though, I think it usually has something to do with an interference with the normal movement of stuff through the system.
Horses have to be moving things from the front to the back. And the way they digest things is a little different than you and I. They have hay and forage that comes through there. They have bacteria in their intestine that work and actually ferment that hay, and they produce a gas. So if the gas is always being produced, it has to be moved from front to back. Now, if there is a problem where either the intestine's not working correctly, or it gets in the wrong place, or in the worst case scenario, twists, then you have a physical obstruction and the gas cannot move from the front to the back, and then you'll get colic. Sometimes it can be a physical blockage, what we call an impaction, where they get dehydrated and then the hay and the material gets stuck in the intestine. And then sometimes it can be where the intestine actually gets out of place. As the horse was designed, it was designed to be a grazing animal, constantly eating, and the intestine, different than you and I, is fairly free to move throughout the abdomen. Where our intestine's pretty firmly attached and it's very difficult to get out of place, the horse's intestine kind of move every which way, and sometimes it gets in a wrong position and then causes a blockage.
So what actually is the danger to the horse of having that kind of obstruction in there?
That's very good. So most people think that the physical blockage is the problem, and it can be, but really what happens, if you get a physical blockage for long enough, the intestine continues to produce gas, and that gas can cause the intestine to really grow in size, and one, make it difficult for the horse to breathe, but two, more importantly, what happens with colic, it's not so much the blockage that causes the problem, but if it's blocked for long enough, the intestine gets somewhat compromised, and they start to absorb some of those toxins that are within the intestine into their bloodstream, and then they get very sick. And those toxins, which we call systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or so in the old term was endotoxemia, those toxins work on the heart, they work on the kidney, they work on the lungs.
Because they're carried by the blood.
Right, to decrease the function, the normal function of those. So eventually what happens if it's not treated, the horses can have multi-organ failure.
So what starts out as a term really for kind of a symptom, we also think of it as the underlying process that's causing the pain.
Right. Early on, he may curl his lip, a flamen response we call it. Well, he'll curl the lip up. He may look at his flank, may stretch out, which is the old term of kidney colic, because they thought that the horses were stretching out to go to the bathroom, but in fact, they're just trying to get comfortable.
Reposition the gut a little bit?
Themselves. And then as it progresses and get worse, the horses may lay down, they may roll, and in the worst case scenario, you can see a horse just standing there absolutely normally, in the next 2 seconds he's laying on the ground. I mean, throwing himself on the ground.
Wow.
Just trying to get some relief.
Wow.
And in those instances, very often it's a more severe colic where the blood supply to the intestine now has been twisted and actually compromised, and that's the most potent stimulus for abdominal pain.
Now, once that blood supply is compromised, doesn't tissue start dying?
It does, and it depends on how tight it is and for how long, but usually if it's a complete twist, you usually have between 3 and 4 hours before that that intestine undergoes an irreversible damage. And in those instances, the only treatment is to go in there, and it's a little bit like a plumbing job. So you have to remove that piece of intestine or that piece of the pipe and then put it back together. Ischemia is when there's no blood flow to the tissue. So ischemia leads to necrosis, which leads to dead intestine.
Now, you talked about one of the things that a horse might do is roll. Sometimes people worry when they see their horse rolling in kind of a normal, everyday context. Mm-hmm. Is that cause for concern?
No, and that's a very common misconception. So people think the horse was rolling and then he
colon. The horse begins by, of course, eating roughage and moving it into his stomach and rapidly through his small intestine into his cecum and his large colon. In the cecum and the large colon, the horse is able to break down the roughage or the plant material into simple sugars by bacterial metabolism that is unlike a human's digestion. The reason that the horse is able to do that, of course, is the symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the horse. In other words, it's beneficial to both species.
Now, what happens earlier in the system up in the stomach?
In the stomach, a horse is going to produce digestive enzymes that can break down sugars and starches, which are in limited supply naturally to a horse. If we can limit the amount of simple sugars and concentrates in a horse's digestive system, they're going to be healthier and do better.